nerds, Monica here. Welcome to the Data Podcast for Nerds, where we get to talk to some pretty awesome professionals and ask them all about how they use data to solve the world's problems, highlighting some careers out there that you might not think are data related. And as always, we include some fun bits because we're all nerds here and we love to have fun. So with us today, we have Chris Chin. How are you, Chris?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on, Monica.
Absolutely. Glad to have you here. So we typically start out our show by learning about people's origin stories, a little bit nerdy. So if you could please explain your background and tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are in your career today.
Sure thing. So there's basically 3 milestones in my career journey. At first, I was in music. So I was an aspiring composer. I wanted to be a famous Hollywood film composer one day. And my life was consumed by creating soundtracks for short films, for advertising. And along the way, I transitioned more into the technical stuff. So I learned more about not just how to write music, but also creating instruments, the physics behind it. I became really fascinated by the scientific and mathematical aspects of music and sound. So I transitioned from music into acoustic engineering as my career trajectory. And over the time working as an acoustic engineer, I felt something was missing from that. I really missed being able to build things as I had in music. So I decided to transition to data, and that was the big second milestone in my career trajectory. I decided to, entirely by myself, without a formal career program, try and transition into data. So I took a bunch of courses online. I did a lot of projects that were a lot of personal projects. And I finally got my first data job at the Department of Transportation, which is why I'm currently based in Washington, D.C. So I did that for about a year and then subsequently had various different jobs within the industry in senior data analyst and business intelligence roles. And that brings me to the final milestone where I am today. I'm now a communication coach for data professionals. And the reason for that is when I was working in the industry, I found how much training there usually is for technical things, but how often there's a lack of training for soft skills. And soft skills are incredibly important, not just for junior positions where perhaps you do a lot of technical stuff and at the very end, maybe you present, but the more you want to rise in the ranks in an organization, you need to be able to communicate well and communicate to different kinds of audiences, from managers to executives to non-technical stakeholders. And that's where having a good grasp of those soft skills of being able to understand how to present effectively becomes so important. And that's what I teach today.
What is your title and your main responsibilities right now?
So right now, I'm a communication coach for tech professionals, and my primary responsibilities include offering one-on-one coaching for professionals who are interested in mastering their communication skills, who perhaps want to be a manager one day and know that communication is important to achieving that, or they want to break into the field, they want to interview well, so they have to prepare a presentation for that, or people who are in the workplace and they feel frustrated by a lack of confidence. They feel like this is a huge pain point for them, that constantly they're faced by this feeling they can't participate in meetings, or perhaps when they give a presentation, they feel like they mess up or that they're not structuring it well or people aren't responding to them well. And that's where I help them master communication so they can build that confidence gradually. And the next time they have a presentation, they feel like they can do a great job.
That's a good approach. So then how would you fold in data to what you're doing currently? I've seen you present on different charts and how to, present those types of different things. So how do you fold in data?
So what I've been doing more this year is focusing not just on the one-on-one coaching, but also team trainings for companies. So this is where I would go in for companies who work with specific data sets within their industries, and I help them tell the stories in the data in an effective way. So this focuses a lot on data storytelling. And I did this a bunch when I was working in the industry itself, in various industries from health insurance to mortgage insurance to transportation to biotechnology. And it all came down to understanding not only what does the data mean, but why is it important to the audience I'm speaking to, and how can we both visually and verbally convey that information to our audience so that they're compelled and persuaded to do something about it.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So I feel like a lot of questions that I want to ask are all fun questions.
Sure.
So we typically don't transition to the fun bits until a little bit later, but I think we're going to do it right now.
Let's do it.
All right. So I first want to ask about your milestone one in your music background, right? How exactly do you think that music background makes you a better presenter?
I'd say it doesn't necessarily make me a better presenter, but a different kind of presenter in the sense
Okay.
that I think about presentation in a very different way than maybe is taught in school or in the workplace. And in school, we're taught that presentations are about giving information. And we sit through and have to give these very boring presentations about various different topics. Nobody enjoys doing or listening to. And in the workplace, we often are told to create these presentations, these slide decks, and then present it to somebody to convey information. But for me, what I think about because of my music background is not just telling people information, but thinking about their experience of that information. So when I was writing music for different kinds of short films, advertising, or for the stage, I was thinking about not only the notes and sounds that I'm producing, but how will my audience experience that? How is my pacing of that? How often should I pause to let the story of the music sink into the audience? So it's more than just information for me. For me, it's about making presentations inspiring for my audience. And I say a presentation isn't about giving information, it's about inspiring action, especially in business workplaces. It's about not just telling people information from your mind and transplanting it into theirs, but telling them what they should do about that information to benefit some kind of business priority.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you ever fold in music to when you're doing consulting with others? And
I do actually. One of my favorite lessons to teach when I do teach delivery for presentations. So this is how you use your voice or how you use body language for delivering that information. I often talk about music as an analogy, and I actually play some things to demonstrate how powerful it is when you have good delivery techniques. So instead of just having a monotone voice where you have the same tone throughout the entire speech that you're giving, if you vary it, that makes the audience interested in what you have to say. Or instead of just talking nonstop, if you build in those pauses and think of pauses as structural elements in addition to words, then that makes your speech a lot more varied and compelling as well. So I like to think of music as kind of the basis for good communication entirely. The more you can make your voice sound like music and musical in both the pitch that you use and the pausing that you use, the more people are likely to listen to it and be engaged by it.
I do have another music question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the cadence of when you present is important, right? And it made me think of the music that you play when you're giving CPR is staying alive.
Yes.
Right? Do you have music that you play or you recommend to play in the background to kind of like pace along your presentation?
Oh, I don't. And actually, it's a funny thing because I love music and I teach music through communication, but I actually don't listen to music when I'm working. So I just can't have music in the background. I need it to be completely silent for me to focus. That's just how my brain works. So I'm funny that way, but it just can't work that way for me.
Well, you and I are both funny because I'm usually just silent mode. Yeah. Maybe I'll have like some white, pink, or brown noise going on in the background, but I can't have the music either unless I'm doing some really mundane task. Then I'll like get my blood pumping, like especially on Fridays, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Or when you're doing dishes or chores, then that's fine because then I need to focus.
Oh yeah. Definitely. Now, I want to ask about like what your favorite lessons learned from presenting.
My favorite lesson learned would probably be related to slides, and that's just to not overload them with content. One of the things that I've often encountered in business workplace settings is slides that are just covered in text because people think of them as giving information. And it's that idea that the more text I put on the slide, the more informed my audience is going to be. But I argue that it's really, again, about the experience and inspiration. If your audience sees that, nobody's going to be inspired to do anything about it. So it's just about switching your mind from thinking about giving information as much as possible and switching it to giving them a good experience of that information as much as possible. So instead of just a ton of text on a slide, break it up into manageable chunks so people can understand each main point you're trying to make over time. And that way they'll actually remember what you said, retain it, and then do something about it.
And you mentioned something, I think it was today in one of your posts, about not memorizing your slides.
Yeah.
Right. Can you give some horror stories there?
So I can probably give one of my own. In high school, I was given one of these standard school presentations to present about, I think it was black holes. And I had memorized every single word I wanted to say. I had written a script. I memorized every single word I had to say in that presentation. And inevitably, and this is what I tell my clients, I was giving the presentation word for word, just following along. And then something happened in the room. I lost my place. And then suddenly I had no idea how to continue the presentation. What word did I leave off on? Where do I continue? And I had so restricted the ability for myself to improvise by laying out every single word that I set myself up for failure. So that presentation is one I remember as the one that I didn't do well on, and that I will always remember because it was one I knew from that point forward that I know how to approach this better. I can not write the script, but I can prepare an outline of the points I want to make and then just rehearse talking freely and naturally through them. So I always tell my clients, don't write the script because that sets you up for failure in a similar way that it did for me. Instead, think about and focus on knowing your material inside and out thoroughly so that you can spontaneously talk through it, not just during the presentation itself, but also in the Q&A after.
And that's a good thing to get used to and start practicing too, because something that comes to my mind is like if you have technical difficulties, right? What if your slides, you can't even show your slides, something happens and you have nothing to show? What would your approach be there?
I do have another post that I went into detail about that exact question, where it's what happens if tech breaks, you can't show any slides, how are you going to deliver the same information? So I always recommend preparing and rehearsing at least once without your slides. A lot of people treat the slides as the presentation, but I argue that it's actually you that are the presentation. People are not sitting in the room with you to read your slides. They're sitting in the room to listen to you give a compelling story about the slides. So the slides have to be visual support for your oral delivery, but you should be able to deliver the same content without them. Instead of treating them as a crutch, just treating them as a support that's not completely necessary. So in case tech breaks and you don't have your slide deck to present on, it's always great to be able to talk through it. And maybe if you have a whiteboard, if you have graphs, you could draw that. And that's actually more engaging for people. You can see in real time you creating the visuals. But the primary thing that I recommend is keeping slides in general minimal to begin with. So it wouldn't be a huge thing if you lost them.
And I know you and I have talked about this before in like, how do you practice presenting or interviewing and all of that? What are your advices there?
I would recommend that people record themselves because it's something we all hate to do. We hate listening to the sound of our own voice. We hate seeing ourselves on camera. But I always tell my clients that's how everybody sees you. So it's better to prepare how to present yourself in a safe setting like your home, where you can perfect it as many times as you want without anybody seeing it. And then when you're ready, you can have that version of yourself ready to show to the world in that perfected state that you're comfortable with. So for any interview or upcoming presentation, rehearse as much as you can in front of a mirror. And then the next step is in front of a camera.
And what do you specifically look for, like when you do practicing recording and you are watching your recording? What are you making notes about?
I particularly make notes about structure and delivery. So structure, how are you beginning the presentation? Am I engaged from your first lines, or am I instantly bored? Because for attention, we have to grab it so quickly from our audience, or they're going to be lost the rest of the ride. We live in an age where there's all this instant gratification, and if you're not giving people that, they're going to tune out. So making sure that the introduction is catchy, that it gives a good roadmap for the entire presentation that's to come. So you lay out kind of like a good storyteller. You lay out the seeds of all the things you're going to say. You foreshadow them so that when people hear them, they're like, oh yeah, you mentioned that at the beginning. Those callback moments are very rewarding for the audience because then they can see how all the pieces of this puzzle you're constructing fit together. So by the end, it's a complete picture. And in addition to that beginning and that kind of structural component, I also listen for delivery. So things like, are you varying the tone in your voice? Are you making sure that you're pausing at the appropriate moments? So, for example, if you've given a very compelling statement, are you going to give that the weight it deserves, or are you going to move immediately to the next phrase? And I think about how each point of the presentation is structured. So how are you logically ordering all your main points? Is it building to something, or is it just a bunch of scattered ideas that you've thought of? So it's really important to focus on not just the information again, but how you structure it in a way that resembles something more of a story that people will be likely to follow.
You mentioned pauses so that people could kind of, comprehend what was just said, think about it. But where do the questions come into play?
And by questions, you mean kind of like the Q&A sessions?
Yeah. So what would your approach be? Would it be to, get questions throughout the presentation? Or would it be to wait for the end of the presentation for a more formal Q&A?
I like having Q&A throughout as opposed to at the end. And the reason for that is because if you have it at the very end, sometimes what happens is that is the end of the presentation. And it's often a feeling like a lackluster end to the presentation. What I recommend is if you have Q&A at the end, that you do come back and give some kind of final statement, some kind of closing for your entire presentation, a good call to action to leave the audience with, instead of just leaving it at a final question. So I recommend also having the Q&A throughout, because if people do have questions, they'll want to ask it when it's most relevant instead of at the very end when they've maybe forgotten it. Why they needed to ask it in the first place. And I also like having it for a third reason, which is it's important to check in with your audience. So if they're not getting something, then maybe you should spend more time on it in the middle section of your presentation instead of at the very end. People say they're confused. It's too late to do anything about it. So those are the three reasons why I would recommend having it throughout the presentation.
Now, how do you gauge whether or not people are receiving the information? Because I know a lot of times, like in classroom settings and such, some people won't be verbal and ask the questions, but they want to ask the questions. Does that make sense? So do you kind of ask the questions to the audience as well?
Yeah, I would recommend both those things. So one, and this is a lot easier when you're in person, is to gauge how people are receiving what you're saying. And I was at an in-person conference recently, and it's significant how the difference is between feeling the energy in the room, if people are getting it or if they're confused, versus virtually, when most of the time maybe cameras are off or people have virtual backgrounds or things are going on. It's a lot harder to keep track of. But I also recommend checking in with your audience. So instead of just talking at them, talking to them in the sense that you see how they're doing. So asking them if something is clicking and making it more interactive than just a monologue is what I usually recommend.
These are all great tips. How about when you have to learn something new? What is your approach to learning new things?
I personally like learning by doing. So I had this class that I took in university on Python. I wanted to learn Python because it was fundamental to having any kind of data career, I felt at the time. And I learned it the typical university route. So the professor would assign lessons to learn, material to read, and homework to do. I did all of that. And at the end, a week after the course finished, I forgot everything that I had learned because I didn't apply it. And I feel like that is often the problem with getting certificates or completing courses is they give you everything you need to do and in a very structured way. But if you don't allow yourself the ability to explore, to dig into problems that might happen, then you're not going to really understand the material. And it's sort of like any activity that we do. If we don't practice it enough, we're not going to learn it. So reading a book about swimming is not going to teach you how to swim. You actually have to swim in order to be a master of swimming. So I learned from that experience that it's best to learn by doing projects. And from that point forward, I just did a bunch of projects in different data sets and different industries to just develop my skills in Python. And by doing that, even all these years later, without practicing it as extensively, I can still remember what to do. So it's really building that muscle memory through messy practice instead of cultivated exercises given to you often by courses.
I don't know why I've never heard that analogy about swimming. That's like the most logical.
I think it was on The Big Bang Theory or something like that.
Was it?
Like, yeah, something like, I think that's where I heard it from.
I wonder if people do like read a book and they're like, got it.
Yeah. It's like a safe environment. I understand. It's sort of like a classroom. It's a safe environment where you're given everything you need to know. And there's no danger, really. You're not going to fall off the guardrails. All the problems that come up are cultivated. They're expected. And it's so much messier when you have to do things all on your own, not knowing what to expect. But that's the most challenging part, but also the part where you're going to learn the most, is where you experience those problems that you can't anticipate.
Absolutely. And another thing you mentioned kind of stood out to me was you said at the time you thought Python was kind of the only way to get into a data career.
I've learned a lot since, especially on LinkedIn. I think the typical refrain is you learn Excel, SQL, and Python is typically not the hardcore fundamental skill you need to know. And in my experience as well, I didn't use Python as much as SQL. I used Python for a few niche projects that required more manual coding and more customization, but it definitely wasn't a huge part of my necessary skill set.
That was my background as well. Very heavy on the SQL and then just the fancy, cool projects. We brought in the Python. I did want to ask a question about your experiences with the Department of Transportation. What kind of projects were you working on there?
I had a blast working there because I was a data journalist. That was my official title. So my task was to have fun exploring the treasure troves of data they have there, figure out interesting stories to tell the public about, and then create data visualizations and short kind of lightning articles to make the public interested in our data so they would go to our website and dig around. And I did this. So every month I would release a new story, a new visual, and I had a ton of fun collaborating with people to create the visuals, especially when they needed more custom graphics. I did this cool project where I created the National Transportation Noise Map, and this leveraged my background in acoustic engineering and music in a beautifully bow tie way, where I visualize the noise across the United States. So you can think about all the noise from airports, from traffic, from any source of major noise in your area, and you can see that on a map using color. And that was a cool project because I was able to visualize that in a map, but also tell a story about it, isolating important things the public would find interesting, and then create infographics about what is sound, what are the units used to measure sound, how should I be concerned, those kinds of things.
That's so funny how you, like the circle of life, right? So you analyze sound, you have a music background, and then you're creating visualizations and telling stories.
Right.
Perfect.
I think about my life in that way, where I've always wanted to tell stories just in different forms. Early on, it was through music. Eventually, it was through data. And now I help people tell their own stories. So it's a beautiful circle for me.
Yes. Amazing. So do you have any final words of encouragement or recommendations for the listeners?
My biggest recommendation would be, and I think this is very much in line with our conversation so far, is to really push yourself to expand your comfort zone. A lot of us prefer to be within our own bubble, our safe space. And it's important that if we want to grow, we have to expand that bubble. I think I liken it to something like a snake growing into new skin. Now, I'm not a snake, but I imagine the process to be slightly uncomfortable, at least, where you have to molt that old stuff and then grow into a new set. And if we want to become stronger and transformed versions of ourselves, we have to let go of what holds us back and we have to push forward. And so for people who might feel unconfident as communicators now, I recommend that it's very hard to feel confident just by thinking it. You have to practice it. And I liken confidence to a muscle, just like the muscles in our body. You have to exercise it if you want to grow and become better at it. So if you have a meeting coming up, I recommend taking small steps. Maybe you can say one thing in the next meeting. Or if you have presentation opportunities, maybe you can volunteer for one. Always pushing yourself to do a little more than the last time will ensure that you continue building on your skill set and you can iteratively grow from unconfident to confident.
Great takeaways. If anybody has any questions, where can they find and or follow you?
So they can follow me on LinkedIn, and they can also check out my website, thehiddenspeaker.com. I have tons of free resources related to data visualization, storytelling, and presentation. And now I started a YouTube channel. So my handle, I believe, is The Hidden Speaker. So people can check out a lot of my short form videos there.
Nice. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. It was lovely chatting with you.
Likewise. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be on, Monica. I had a lot of fun recording this episode.
Absolutely. And as always, folks, happy learning.